The moon cast long shadows across the town of Redemption Creek as Silas Ironhand Mercer meticulously polished the barrel of a custom-made Winchester. His weathered hands moved with practiced precision, each motion refined by decades of craftsmanship. The workshop glowed with the dying embers of the forge, tools hanging in perfect order along the walls. This sanctuary of creation had stood for 30 years, becoming as much a legend as the man himself. Folks traveled hundreds of miles for an Ironhand firearm. Some said his guns never jammed, others claimed they could hit targets no ordinary weapon could reach. But what most admired was the integrity of the man behind the metal. Silas had refused countless offers from men of questionable character, believing a weapon was only as honorable as the hand that held it. "Almost done, old friend," Silas murmured to the rifle, running a cloth along its gleaming surface. "You'll serve Sheriff Williams well." The sudden pounding on his door shattered the peaceful evening. Before Silas could respond, the wooden entrance splintered open, and 5 men stormed inside. Their leader stepped forward, a tall figure with a scar cutting across his left cheek. A black hat shadowed his eyes, but his smile was visible, cold and calculating. "Silas Mercer," the man drawled, removing his hat with mocking courtesy. "The famous gunsmith. I'm Jed Carrigan, though most folks call me Black Jack." Silas remained calm, though his grip tightened on the rifle. "My shop's closed, gentlemen. Come back tomorrow if you need business." Jed's laugh echoed through the workshop. "Oh, we need business all right. 20 rifles, finest quality, and whatever cash you've got hidden away." "I don't deal with outlaws," Silas replied, his voice quiet but firm. "Now kindly leave my shop." The bandits exchanged glances, amused by his defiance. Jed's smile vanished, replaced by a hard stare. "You misunderstand. This isn't a request." "And you misunderstand what kind of man I am," Silas countered. "I'd rather burn this place to the ground than arm men like you." Jed's eyes flashed dangerously. "That can be arranged." He nodded to his men. "Seems the old man needs a lesson in cooperation. Burn it down, boys." Before Silas could react, 2 bandits grabbed him, forcing him to his knees. He struggled against their grip as the others began smashing bottles of oil and gunpowder across the workshop floor. Jed struck a match, the small flame dancing between his fingers. "Last chance, old man. Where are your weapons stored?" Silas stared into Jed's eyes and said, "Go to hell." With a shrug, Jed dropped the match. Flames erupted instantly, hungrily consuming 30 years of craftsmanship. The bandits dragged Silas outside, forcing him to watch as his life's work transformed into an inferno. The heat scorched his face, but he didn't look away. "Remember this night," Jed whispered in his ear. "Remember what happens to men who defy Black Jack Carrigan." They left him kneeling in the dirt as the fire reached toward the night sky. Townsfolk gathered at a distance, their faces illuminated by the blaze, too afraid to approach. But none saw what truly burned in Silas's eyes, not defeat, but a cold, unwavering promise of retribution. As the flames claimed his past, Silas Mercer made a silent vow. This wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from and if you've ever stood up against someone who tried to push you around. And make sure you're subscribed, because what happens next in this story will leave you speechless. Dawn broke over Redemption Creek, pale sunlight revealing the devastation where Silas Mercer's workshop once stood. Charred beams jutted from the ground like broken bones. Tools that had crafted masterpieces now lay twisted and blackened beyond recognition. The acrid smell of burnt wood and melted metal hung heavy in the morning air. Silas stood amid the ruins, his face etched with lines of exhaustion. He hadn't slept. How could he, when everything he'd built over 3 decades had been reduced to cinders in a single night? His calloused fingers sifted through the ashes, occasionally finding a remnant. A hammerhead, a file, fragments of what once was. "Mr. Mercer?" A hesitant voice broke through his thoughts. Mayor Thompson stood at what used to be the doorway, hat in hands. I don't know what to say. This is a terrible tragedy." Silas didn't look up. "Where were the town deputies last night, Mayor?" Thompson shifted uncomfortably. "You know how it is with Kerrigan's gang. They've got numbers, weapons. Our boys wouldn't stand a chance." Around them, townsfolk gathered at a cautious distance, their whispers carrying on the morning breeze. Third business they've hit this month. Nobody can stand against Black Jack. Poor Silas, all those years of work. Their fear was palpable, a living thing that had taken root in Redemption Creek. Silas understood their terror. Kerrigan's reputation for brutality stretched across 3 counties. Those who resisted rarely lived to speak of it. As he continued sifting through the wreckage, his hand closed around something solid, a partially melted frame of the first pistol he'd ever crafted. Memories washed over him, eager young apprentices learning at his bench, the satisfaction of a perfectly balanced firearm, the pride of knowing his creations protected good people. "They think they've broken me," Silas muttered, tucking the melted gun frame into his pocket. "They think this ends here." "Silas, I understand your anger," Mayor Thompson said cautiously. "But Kerrigan isn't someone you can fight. He's got 30 men, all killers. The smart move is to rebuild elsewhere, start fresh." Silas finally turned to face him, and something in his gaze made Thompson take a step back. The usual gentle craftsman was gone, replaced by something harder, something forged in the flames of the previous night. "I'm not running, Mayor. This is my home." "Then what will you do? You can't fight them alone?" "No," Silas agreed, his mind already racing through faces from his past. "Not alone." As Thompson left, Silas remained among the ruins, planning. Before he was the respected gunsmith of Redemption Creek, he'd been something else entirely. A man who knew the weight of a gun in his hand for reasons beyond craftsmanship. There were others too, men and women who had hung up their weapons years ago, seeking peace. Good people who owed him favors. People who understood that sometimes justice required more than law books and badges. The townsfolk saw an old man standing in the ashes of his life's work. They didn't see what was hardening within him. Resolve, cold as steel, and twice as unyielding. That evening, as the sun set over the blackened remains of his workshop, Silas Mercer made his decision. He would call in debts long owed, gathering those who had once been the finest fighters in the territory. Together, they would teach Jed Kerrigan that some fires don't destroy, they temper. And what emerges from such flames is far more dangerous than what entered them. By lamplight, Silas Mercer's hand moved steadily across the paper, his script precise despite the tremble in his aging fingers. 5 letters lay before him, each addressed to someone who'd once saved his life, or whose life he'd saved. People who understood that some debts transcend time and distance. "They'll come," he whispered to the empty room of the boarding house where he now slept. "They have to." The first letter was addressed to Ezekiel Deadeye Foster. Once the finest marksman in the territory, Ezekiel could hit a playing card edge-on at 100 yards. 15 years ago, Silas had crafted him a custom rifle with modifications no other gunsmith could achieve. With that weapon, Ezekiel had survived the infamous Jefferson County standoff, taking down 8 outlaws without reloading. Silas sealed the envelope with a drop of wax. "For the rifle that saved your life," he murmured, "and for the blood debt you swore." 3 days later, and 70 miles away, Ezekiel Foster sat on his porch, watching the sun dip behind the distant mountains. His homestead was modest but peaceful, a small cattle ranch that provided just enough to live on. He'd built this quiet life carefully, brick by brick, year by year, distancing himself from the man he once was. The approaching rider didn't alarm him. Out here, travelers occasionally stopped for water or directions. But as the figure drew closer, Ezekiel recognized the Redemption Creek postal rider. "Mail for you, Mr. Foster," the young man called, extending an envelope. "Came all the way from Redemption. Seems important." Ezekiel nodded his thanks, waiting until the writer departed before breaking the seal. His eyes scanned the contents, narrowing at certain passages. By the time he finished reading, the letter was trembling in his hand. Inside his cabin, dust had gathered on a long wooden box beneath his bed. Ezekiel hadn't opened it in nearly a decade. Now he pulled it out, running his hand across the smooth wood before lifting the lid. Inside lay the rifle, Silas Mercer's masterpiece. Even after all these years, the metal gleamed in the lamplight, maintained through ritual cleaning, though never fired. "I swore I was done with this life," Ezekiel whispered, lifting the weapon. Its weight was familiar, like greeting an old friend. He sighted down the barrel, muscle memory returning instantly. But a debt is a debt. With the rifle, he extracted a small wooden case containing a tarnished silver star, his badge from another lifetime. He'd been more than just a marksman. He'd been a lawman, sworn to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. Before the nightmares, before the whiskey, before the choice to disappear. By midnight, Ezekiel had packed his saddlebags. He stood in the doorway, taking one last look at the sanctuary he'd built. There was no guarantee he'd return. Men like Kerrigan didn't fall easily, and skills grew rusty with disuse. But some bonds couldn't be broken, not even by years of silence. "Getting too old for this," he muttered, securing his rifle to his saddle. Yet as he mounted up, something long dormant stirred within him. Purpose, perhaps. Or the dangerous thrill of knowing he would soon use the talents he'd buried. As the first light of dawn broke across the eastern sky, Ezekiel Foster rode toward Redemption Creek, the letter from Silas folded inside his vest pocket, close to his heart. The rhythm of hoofbeats matched the steady cadence of his thoughts. A debt must be paid. A wrong must be righted. And some men deserve the bullet that finds them. Behind him, his cabin stood empty, the door unlocked. He hadn't bothered securing it. Either he would return victorious, or he wouldn't return at all. The schoolhouse of Pine Valley sat nestled against rolling hills, its white-painted boards gleaming in the afternoon sun. Children's laughter spilled from the open windows as Annie Malone guided her students through their arithmetic lessons. At 38, she'd found peace in this quiet town, far from the whispers that had once followed her name across saloons and wanted posters. "Remember, children," she said, her voice gentle but firm, "mathematics requires precision. Just like—" She caught herself before saying shooting. "Old habits die hard. Just like any worthwhile endeavor." As the school day ended and children scattered toward waiting parents, Annie noticed the solitary figure leaning against the oak tree across the yard. Even at a distance, she recognized Silas Mercer immediately. Her hand instinctively moved to her hip, where two Colt revolvers had once rested in custom holsters, his craftsmanship, of course. "Class dismissed," she announced, though the children were already halfway out the door. Annie waited until the schoolyard emptied before approaching him. 15 years had carved deeper lines into his face, but his eyes remained the same, steady, perceptive, missing nothing. "Silas Mercer," she said, stopping several paces away. "I heard you'd settled down in Redemption Creek. Respectable gunsmith now." "And you found your calling, molding young minds," he replied with a nod toward the schoolhouse. "It suits you better than I would have guessed." A smile tugged at her lips. "Better than six-shot Annie? Terror of the territories? That wasn't a high bar to clear?" She gestured toward her modest home adjacent to the schoolhouse. "Come inside. Whatever brought you this far deserves coffee at least." In her kitchen, as coffee boiled on the stove, Silas recounted the burning of his workshop. Annie listened silently, her expression darkening at the mention of Jed Kerrigan. "Black Jack," she murmured. "We crossed paths once, years ago. He wasn't running with a gang then, but he had the look, a man convinced the world owes him something." Now he's collecting that debt from innocent people, Silas said, sliding a folded paper across the table. I'm gathering those who can stop him. Those I trust. Annie didn't touch the paper. I left that life behind, Silas. These people here, they don't know who I was. To them, I'm just Miss Malone who teaches their children fractions. And if Kerrigan and his kind keep spreading, how long before they reach Pine Valley? How long before your students learn that arithmetic isn't enough to protect them? Her jaw tightened. That's not fair. None of this is fair, Silas replied softly. But we once swore an oath, Annie. Not to a badge or a territory, but to each other. To stand against men who prey on those weaker than themselves. Annie rose abruptly, moving to a small writing desk in the corner. From a locked drawer, she withdrew a wooden box. When she opened it, Silas glimpsed the gleam of twin revolvers nestled in velvet. His own creations, masterpieces of balance and precision. I haven't fired these in 7 years, she said, her fingers hovering above the weapons without touching them. I promised myself I never would again. I wouldn't ask if there was another way. She closed her eyes briefly. The school term ends in 3 days. I'll need to find a substitute teacher. When she looked at Silas again, something had shifted in her gaze, a hardness returning, like steel emerging from beneath soft cloth. And Silas? If I do this, it's my last ride. Win or lose, I'm done after Kerrigan. Fair enough, he nodded. That night, after Silas departed, Annie stood before her mirror, studying her reflection. She removed the pins from her hair, letting it fall loose around her shoulders. Then, with practiced motions that belied her years away from gunfighting, she drew the revolvers from their box, spinning them once around her fingers before settling into a stance she'd hoped never to assume again. One last time, she whispered to her reflection. For the oath. Outside, the peaceful town slept, unaware that their school teacher had just silently said goodbye. The ruins of Silas's workshop had been cleared away, the charred debris hauled off to make room for what would come next. In its place stood a temporary structure, crude, hastily assembled from salvaged timber, but functional. At its center burned a new forge, smaller than his previous one, but hot enough for what needed to be done. Ezekiel arrived first, dismounting with the careful movements of a man whose joints protested loudly with each passing year. Annie followed 2 days later, her school teacher's dresses replaced by practical riding clothes. They greeted each other with reserved nods of people who shared complicated history. As if summoned by their reunion, a shadow detached itself from the tree line. The figure moved with unnatural silence, seeming to glide rather than walk. Finn, Annie whispered, recognition in her voice. Finn, shadow. Callahan stepped into the light, his face weathered as old leather, eyes dark as river stones beneath his hat. Unlike the others, he wore no gun. His weapons of choice had always been knives and lassos. Heard you were gathering the old guard, Finn said, his voice a dry rasp. Figured you might need someone who can track. Kerrigan's gang has a hideout. Nobody knows exactly where. I do, Finn replied. Been watching them for 2 weeks. 28 men. Camp in the limestone caves north of Devil's Backbone Ridge. That still leaves us outnumbered 7-1, Ezekiel observed. Silas turned to the forge, pulling out a glowing rod of metal. With practiced strikes of his hammer, he began shaping it. Numbers aren't everything. As the day progressed, Silas worked tirelessly, reforging what weapons he could salvage. For Annie, he balanced her revolvers to perfection. For Ezekiel, he crafted custom ammunition. For Finn, a set of throwing knives, each blade tempered to hold a perfect edge. This isn't just about my workshop, Silas said as they gathered around a small fire. Kerrigan and his men have terrorized 3 counties. They've killed ranchers, robbed stagecoaches, burned out homesteaders. And the law? Ezekiel asked. Bought or buried? Silas confirmed grimly. As Finn marked locations on a crude map, the others leaned forward, studying the terrain. Despite the years apart, they fell into their old patterns seamlessly. Ezekiel identifying firing positions, Annie calculating timing, Finn noting escape routes. It wasn't a perfect plan. 4 aging fighters against a young, ruthless gang. But watching them work together in the firelight, Silas felt something he hadn't experienced since the night of the fire. Hope. "Rest up," he told them. "Tomorrow, we start reminding these bandits why some legends shouldn't be forgotten." Jed "Blackjack" Kerrigan reclined in his makeshift throne, an ornate chair stolen from a governor's mansion, surveying his domain with cold satisfaction. The limestone caves served his purposes perfectly, defensible, spacious, and all but invisible unless you knew where to look. "Another successful haul," his Lieutenant Miller announced, dumping a satchel of jewelry onto the table. "The Billings stagecoach never knew what hit him." "Any resistance?" Jed asked. "One passenger tried to be a hero," Miller chuckled. "He's feeding the coyotes now." The irony wasn't lost on Jed. 15 years ago, he'd worn a marshal's badge with pride. He'd believed in justice then, until the night he returned from a manhunt to find his home burned to the ground, his wife and young daughter dead inside. The Harlow gang had left their calling card, a black jack of spades, in the ashes. When Jed discovered the territorial governor had struck a deal with the Harlows, overlooking their crimes for political support, something broke inside him. He'd tracked down each member of the Harlow gang and sent them to their graves. Then he turned his rage on the corrupt officials who'd protected them. When the dust settled, Blackjack the Outlaw was born. "Boss?" Miller's voice broke through his memories. "That gunsmith whose shop we torched." "Word is he's gathering people. Old gunslingers." Jed laughed. "The old man? What's he going to do? Throw his walking stick at us?" "These ain't just any gunslingers," Miller persisted. "They're saying 6-shot Annie's with him, and that ghost tracker, Callahan." A murmur ran through the men. Even hardened outlaws knew those names. Later that night, Jed studied his journal of newspaper clippings and wanted posters focusing on images of Annie Malone, Ezekiel Foster, and Finn Callahan. "So the old legends want to dance," he murmured. "Let's see if they remember the steps." Tomorrow, Redemption Creek would learn exactly what it meant to defy Blackjack Kerrigan. The main street of Redemption Creek transformed into a tableau of terror as Jed Kerrigan and 15 of his men thundered into town, guns drawn and faces set in predatory grins. Storekeepers barricaded their doors while mothers pulled playing children from the street. Gunshots punctuated the air as bandits fired into signs and windows. "Come out! Come out! Wherever you are!" Jed's voice boomed. "Where's that gunsmith who thinks he can stand against me?" From shadowed alleys, Annie and Ezekiel watched with restrained anger. "I count 16, Ezekiel murmured, "including Kerrigan." "We could take them now," Annie whispered, fingers resting on her revolvers. Across the street, partially hidden, Silas shook his head slightly. "Not yet." They watched as Kerrigan's men methodically moved through town, kicking in doors, emptying store shelves, and tossing valuables into saddlebags. Outside the bank, bandits forced the manager to open the safe, roughly shoving him to his knees. "Where's your famous defiance now, Redemption Creek?" Jed taunted. "Seems your spirit breaks easily enough when facing real men." Finn, invisible in the shadows of the livery stable roof, signed a message to Silas. 12 more men stationed at town entrances, watching for law. The brutality escalated as bandits dragged several townsfolk into the street, forcing them to kneel in the dust. The blacksmith tried to resist and received a rifle butt to the skull, dropping him as his wife screamed. Annie's hand tightened on her gun. "Silas!" she hissed. "We can't just watch this!" "Not yet," Silas replied, each word painful. "We stick to the plan." "What plan?" Annie demanded. "Let innocent people suffer while we hide? If we show ourselves now, we die. Silas replied. "And then there's no one left to stand against them." Jed strutted before the kneeling townsfolk. Consider this a reminder of who's really in charge. Your lives, your businesses, your precious little town. It all exists because I allow it. He fired twice into the air. Next time, these bullets find more interesting targets. After an hour of deliberate humiliation, the bandits finally rode out, leaving behind broken windows, looted stores, and a town collectively holding its breath. Later, as they regrouped, Annie confronted Silas. That was hard to watch, harder still to do nothing. Silas nodded understanding. Sometimes the hardest fights aren't won with bullets. They're won by breaking a man's belief in his own invincibility. Today, Kerrigan thinks he's untouchable. Tomorrow, we will begin teaching him otherwise. Night fell over Redemption Creek, bringing with it an unusual flurry of activity. One by one, select townsfolk slipped through the darkness toward the livery stable. Inside, they found Silas and his companions waiting, the space transformed into an impromptu training ground. "What I'm about to teach you isn't about heroics," Silas began, his voice low but carrying. "It's about survival, about protecting what's yours when there's no one else to do it for you." Ezekiel stepped forward, laying several disassembled rifles on a table. "Most of you have hunting pieces, shotguns, fine for game, but you need to understand their limitations against men who live by the gun." The blacksmith raised his chin defiantly. "I've shot deer since I was 12. I know how to handle a firearm." "A deer doesn't shoot back," Annie countered, her tone sharp but not unkind. "What we're teaching isn't just marksmanship, it's strategy." They divided the volunteers into groups. Ezekiel worked with those who showed aptitude with rifles, teaching them to shoot from cover. Annie drilled others on quick drawing and firing from the hip. Finn taught a smaller group how to move silently and set simple traps. "Remember," Silas called out periodically, "we're not training you to be gunfighters. We're teaching you to be a community that can defend itself." Later, Finn slipped away to scout and returned with news. "Kerrigan's men are celebrating at their camp, but they've doubled their sentries. They're expecting trouble." Outside, Annie confronted Silas privately. "These people aren't fighters. A few days of training won't turn them into an army." "They don't need to be an army," Silas replied. "Just a thorn in Kerrigan's side. A constant reminder that his control isn't absolute." Finn emerged from the shadows. "I might have something. The limestone caves have a weakness. An old mining shaft that was abandoned years ago. It doesn't lead directly into their hideout, but it gets close. Close enough to hear them planning their next moves," Finn added. "Maybe close enough for something more direct when the time comes." As the night progressed, more townspeople arrived, drawn by whispered invitations and the increasingly evident truth that Kerrigan's reign would only end when they stood against it. By dawn, nearly 30 men and women had received basic instruction. As they dispersed, Silas caught the blacksmith's arm. "Tell no one what you've learned. Let Kerrigan think his demonstration broke the town's spirit." "When the time comes, we'll be ready," the blacksmith promised. The waning moon cast just enough light for Finn to navigate the rugged terrain leading to Devil's Backbone Ridge. Behind him moved Silas, Annie, and Ezekiel, each step carefully placed to avoid detection. The night creatures had gone silent, sensing the predators in their midst. Finn raised his hand, halting the group. Ahead, a sentry's silhouette was visible against the starlit sky, a cigarette's ember briefly flaring. "Sloppy," Finn whispered. "They've gotten comfortable." With practiced precision, Ezekiel assembled his rifle in darkness, while Annie positioned herself to flank the eastern approach. Finn melted away toward the main entrance where 2 more guards stood watch. At exactly midnight, Ezekiel's rifle cracked once. The distant sentry crumpled silently. Before the echo faded, Annie's revolvers created a barrage from another direction, sounding like multiple attackers. Near the cave entrance, Finn moved like a shadow, incapacitating one guard before he could shout a warning. The second managed to fire once before Finn's knife found his shoulder, a disabling wound, not fatal. Chaos erupted as bandits poured from the cave, half-dressed and confused, firing blindly into darkness. Ezekiel's rifle spoke twice more, forcing them back in disarray. The attack lasted less than 3 minutes. When it ended, one sentry lay dead, 2 wounded, and Kerrigan's men were left shooting at phantoms. While the bandits huddled at the cave entrance, Silas approached from the blind side of the ridge. He placed a parcel at the mouth of an abandoned mining shaft, a perfectly crafted 6-shooter with a note. "For every innocent harmed, one of yours falls. This is your only warning." The Gunsmith. By dawn, they were back at camp outside Redemption Creek. The weight of the night's work settled differently on each. Ezekiel more distant, Annie's movements sharper, Finn's silence deeper. Mayor Thompson arrived with news. "It's all over town. Kerrigan's men rode in at first light with their wounded. They're saying ghosts attacked them, spirits seeking revenge." "Kerrigan's offering $1,000 for information," he continued. "But some of his men are leaving, saying the territory's become haunted." Silas nodded with satisfaction. He's afraid, but a frightened snake strikes harder. He'll lash out at the town. "The people are ready," Thompson replied firmly. "Your training has spread. Everyone's preparing." Silas gazed toward Redemption Creek where the blacksmith's forge burned hot. "Now," he said quietly, "we begin to hunt them one by one." Silas studied the crude map spread across the stump serving as their planning table. Red marks indicated Kerrigan's supply caches, blue showed patrol routes, and black crosses marked bandit sightings reported by Finn's growing network of informants. "His operation is larger than we thought," Silas observed, "but more vulnerable too. He's stretched thin, trying to maintain control across too much territory." Annie pointed to a narrow pass marked on the map. "This is where their ammunition comes through. Monthly deliveries from a corrupt quartermaster at Fort Laramie." "That shipment is due tomorrow," Ezekiel added. 20,000 rounds plus dynamite for their mining operation." Silas's eyes gleamed in the firelight. Cut off the ammunition, and their advantage shrinks considerably. The ambush was set before dawn. Ezekiel positioned on a ridge, Annie and Finn concealed among boulders, with Silas waiting beyond the choke point. When the wagon appeared, Ezekiel's rifle barked once. The lead rider tumbled from his saddle, creating confusion that allowed Annie and Finn to eliminate the remaining guards with swift efficiency. The wagon driver raised his hands in surrender. Don't shoot. I'm just hired to drive." "We have no quarrel with you," Silas assured him. "Tell Kerrigan the gunsmith sends his regards. Tell him every bullet meant for innocence has been turned away." They unloaded the ammunition, hiding most in a nearby cave and keeping only what they needed. The explosives they rigged beneath the wagon bed. "Drive until you're clear of the pass," Silas instructed. "Then run. The wagon won't last much longer." The resulting explosion echoed across 3 counties, a smoke plume visible for miles, a deliberate signal that the balance of power was shifting. Back in camp, Silas worked through the night, modifying bullets taken from the shipment. With precision, he altered powder loads, creating rounds that would jam any weapon they were used in. "We'll make sure these find their way back to Kerrigan's men," he explained. The following days brought calculated strikes. A bandit patrol vanished, their horses returning riderless. A cache of stolen goods was discovered empty, with only Silas's signature silver bullet left behind. Water sources near the caves were fouled, forcing bandits further afield for supplies. "They're fighting among themselves now," Finn reported after scouting, blaming each other for missing supplies. 3 more rode out last night. The culmination came when Silas infiltrated the bandit supply route. With Finn's guidance, he located hidden caches and sabotaged the weapons, filing firing pins, weakening triggers, replacing ammunition with doctored rounds. News of each strike reached Redemption Creek, bolstering townspeople's courage. Training continued nightly until nearly half the town had basic defensive skills. "Kerrigan's called in everyone," Ezekiel announced, returning from reconnaissance. "They're gathering at the caves." "He's preparing for a final stand," Silas nodded. "His control is slipping. A man like that can't retreat. His ego won't allow it." "So what's our next move?" Annie asked, cleaning her revolvers. "We don't need numbers," Silas replied. "Kerrigan won't hide forever, not with his reputation crumbling. He'll come for us, and when he does, we'll be ready." The stage was set. The bandits, once nearly 30 strong, had been reduced to 18 through desertion and carefully planned eliminations. Silas looked toward town, where lanterns glowed in windows that once would have been darkened in fear. "Tomorrow," he said quietly, "we will send Kerrigan his invitation." Dawn's light crept across Redemption Creek as Silas and his companions took their positions. The town appeared deserted, doors closed and windows shuttered, creating an eerie stillness. Only the occasional glint of metal from rooftops or shadows behind windows revealed the truth. The entire community waited, armed and ready. "Remember," Silas had told the townsfolk the night before, "this isn't about heroics. It's about standing together. No one fights alone." Ezekiel had positioned himself in the church bell tower, his rifle loaded with Silas's custom ammunition. Annie waited in the schoolhouse, both revolvers ready. Finn had vanished before sunrise, becoming one with the landscape surrounding town. Silas himself stood alone in the middle of the street, directly in front of where his workshop had once stood. Behind him, a crude wooden sign had been erected overnight. "Kerrigan, face me or leave these lands forever. The Gunsmith." The challenge couldn't be ignored without Kerrigan losing what remained of his fearsome reputation. Silas had calculated that risk precisely, turning the bandit leader's pride into a weapon against him. The first sign of their approach came with a dust cloud on the horizon, followed by the distant thunder of hoofbeats. As they drew closer, Silas counted 14 riders, fewer than expected, but still dangerous odds. Jed Kerrigan led them, his black hat pulled low over his eyes, twin revolvers gleaming at his hips. He reined in 20 paces from where Silas stood, studying the gunsmith with cold calculation. "Brave of you to face me alone, old man," Kerrigan called out, his voice carrying across the silent street. "Who said I was alone?" Silas replied calmly. At his words, movement rippled across the town. Townsfolk appeared at windows and doorways, rifles and shotguns leveled at the bandits. From the church tower, Ezekiel's rifle gleamed in the sunlight. Annie stepped onto the schoolhouse porch, revolvers drawn. Kerrigan's men shifted uneasily, suddenly aware of how exposed they were. But their leader's face showed only amusement. "Touching," he sneered. "You've got farmers and shopkeepers playing soldier. My men eat their kind for breakfast." "Try us and find out," came a voice from behind a water trough. The blacksmith, his normally gentle face set with grim determination. Kerrigan's smile vanished. He turned back to Silas, his expression hardening. "This ends today, one way or another. You took everything from me. My reputation, my control. Time to settle accounts." "You took everything from me first," Silas replied, no fear in his steady gaze. "But this isn't about vengeance anymore. It's about justice." "Justice?" Kerrigan laughed bitterly. "There's no such thing. I learned that the hard way." His hand hovered near his gun. "Let's finish this, gunsmith. Just you and me." The tension stretched taut as a bowstring. Then, with movements too fast for the eye to follow, both men drew. 2 shots rang out in perfect unison, echoing between the buildings of Redemption Creek. For a heartbeat, neither man moved. Then Kerrigan looked down at the spreading crimson stain on his chest, surprise washing over his features. "How?" he gasped, swaying in the saddle. "I was a gunsmith," Silas said quietly, a thin trail of blood running down his left arm where Kerrigan's bullet had grazed him. "But before that, I was something else entirely." Kerrigan tumbled from his horse, dead before he hit the ground. Silence hung over Redemption Creek, broken only by the soft creak of leather as the remaining bandits shifted nervously in their saddles. Their leader lay in the dust, the invincible Blackjack Kerrigan reduced to just another dead outlaw. Miller, Kerrigan's lieutenant, found his voice first. "Kill them all," he growled, reaching for his gun. But as the bandits raised their weapons, guns misfired, hammers fell on doctored ammunition, triggers jammed or broke entirely. "Now!" Silas shouted, and the town erupted into action. The blacksmith and neighbors opened fire from their positions. Ezekiel's rifle spoke with deadly precision from the church tower. Annie's revolvers blazed from the schoolhouse steps. And from behind the bandits, Finn emerged like a vengeful spirit, taking down 2 outlaws before they knew he was there. The battle was brief but fierce. 3 bandits fell immediately. Others turned to flee, only to find escape routes blocked by townspeople who had once cowered at Kerrigan's name. Miller threw down his useless weapon and surrendered. The remaining bandits quickly followed suit. "It's over," Silas announced. "Kerrigan's reign ends today." By sunset, the wounded had been tended to, the dead buried, and surviving bandits locked in the town jail. The territorial marshal, summoned by urgent rider, promised to arrive within days. Silas stood amid the rubble of his former workshop, watching the townsfolk celebrate around a bonfire. Annie approached with coffee. "Planning to rebuild?" she asked. Silas nodded. "Not just the workshop, something more." "A legacy," she said, understanding in her eyes. "You could stay," he suggested. "All of you." Annie smiled but shook her head. "I made a promise. This was my last ride." She glanced to where Ezekiel and Finn sat by the fire. "Though I can't speak for them." The next morning, the people of Redemption Creek gathered to help clear the ruins. Men who had once turned away in fear now worked alongside the gunsmith. Women brought food and bandaged blistered hands. Children carried water and tools. As the new forge took shape, Ezekiel approached. "I'm staying," the marksman said simply. "Got nothing waiting for me but dust and memories." Finn nodded his agreement. "Plenty of tracks still to follow around here." Though Annie departed the following day, her influence remained. The women of Redemption Creek formed their own shooting club under the blacksmith's wife's leadership. 1 month later, as Silas struck the first hammer blow on his new anvil, the sound rang clear across Redemption Creek. It was more than just the rebirth of a workshop. It was the forging of a community that would never again bend to tyranny. Word spread throughout the territory. Cross the people of Redemption Creek at your peril. The legend of Silas Ironhand Mercer grew with each retelling. But the true legacy wasn't the legend. It was in the quiet determination of ordinary people who had discovered their own strength. It was in the knowledge that standing together against evil wasn't just possible, it was necessary. As for Silas, he continued crafting masterpieces. But now, he also crafted something more valuable, a community forged in fire, tempered by adversity, and stronger than any metal. If you thought this story was intense, you won't want to miss what happens in our next video. Let me know in the comments which character was your favorite, and don't forget to subscribe for more tales of the Wild West.